Hello, everybody. I am here today with a repeat guest. This is Dr. Lydia McGrew. Dr. Lydia has been on my channel once before, and now we're having her on again to talk about her book, The Eye of the Beholder. I just want to do a little brief introduction that I'll be doing something of a series on the Gospel of John, I think, in the early part of 2022, where I'll be bringing in experts to talk about the Gospel of John and what it's about, what it means. And so Dr. Lydia is actually kind of the first guest in that series, although actually once upon a time, I think last year I had Dr. Joanne Brandt, who had a commentary on the Gospel of John, but that was before I thought of doing something more of a focused series on the Gospel of John. So Dr. Lydia McGrew, in case you don't know, is a philosopher, and she has written multiple books. She has her own YouTube channel, Lydia McGrew, which I will link in the description. I would highly recommend her videos. And I guess, do you want to introduce yourself, Lydia?
Sure. So I'm an analytic philosopher specializing in epistemology, theory of knowledge, especially formal epistemology, which relates to probability theory and that kind of thing. And then in the last 5 years, I've combined that with some cross-disciplinary work in New Testament studies, where I'm trying to bring my knowledge as an analytic philosopher into New Testament studies and the case for the resurrection, which my husband Tim and I have always been deeply interested in, and just kind of make that as strong an argument as we can, because I believe there is a very strong argument and for gospel reliability and for Jesus' resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. And so I really enjoy talking with you and interacting with your works, partially because I'm a statistician myself, and you talk about Bayes theory and Bayes factors and bring in probability theory into your arguments. And I enjoy anytime I get to mix together my interests in statistics and theology, and that doesn't happen very often, and you give me the opportunity to do that, so I enjoy that aspect of your work. I should also say, just in case you are, anyone out there listening is coming here as a fan of Lydia and doesn't know who I am already, that I am a biblical Unitarian, often classified as non-orthodox or heretical by mainstream evangelicalism, or mainstream Christianity at large, I guess you could say. So we just wanted to put that disclaimer lest anyone get surprised or confused or anything about that.
Yes, so Sam is the nicest heretic I know. So last time we were explicitly discussing it. So I asked him to put it out there at the beginning here so that no one would think that I'm endorsing his views, because I'm an Orthodox Trinitarian. And so we're not going to actually be discussing that today. We're going to be discussing the Gospel of John itself and its historicity more. And I just didn't want anyone to think that because I'm on the channel that I'm on board with Sam's views on the deity of Jesus, since it probably won't come up again in this conversation.
Sure. And in case anyone wants to hear us discussing that topic a little bit more explicitly, I would encourage our last conversation. I re-listened to that conversation of ours a couple of days ago in preparation for this. And I was like, man, I forgot how it got a little spicy there for a while. We talked about John 8:58 and tangents related to that for, I think, almost over an hour.
It was great fun. It was a lot of fun.
It was fun. And so, but this will be talking more about Lydia's recent book, The Eye of the Beholder, and the Gospel of John itself. Obviously, Christology is an unavoidable and an important topic related to the Gospel of John, so it's not like we will be completely avoiding that subject. And also, obviously, that would be why I'm interested in talking about the Gospel of John so much on my channel. My channel focuses on Christology and theology and history and those sorts of things. So this episode is a perfect intersection of a lot of those interests. But another thing that we wanted to talk about before we kind of got going into the meat of the conversation is Lydia has her camera off for this conversation and this recording. And I guess I I'll pass it over to you, Lydia, to talk about sort of your medical reasons for that.
Yeah, for 10 months now, starting in April of 2021, I've been in severe chronic pain. And that got kicked off, I'm sorry to say, by the COVID-19 vaccine, just one dose. And I was very healthy before that. So the upshot here is that I need to be mostly lying down. And for much of the time, I managed to do my YouTube channel. And I was just saying to Sam, people are going to think I'm lying about this because I managed to record those videos. I find time slots when I can stand or sit up for a while and just do those in a week. But in general, I spend most of my time reclining on a couch, and it's virtually impossible for me to get a good camera angle for that with, my head reclining against a pillow. It just looks absolutely awful. So I said to Sam, hey, I'll be able to concentrate more if I have just a headset on, and then I can sit however I want and have that plugged into the computer. So that's what we're doing here, and that's why that's turned off.
Mm-hmm. Which vaccine brand did you take?
I took Pfizer.
Mm-hmm. And you can hear more about Lydia's health story related to the vaccine. You were on an episode of the Dark Horse podcast with Brett Weinstein that I would also highly recommend. I thought that was a really good episode. And I just want to say I admire your bravery and courage in telling your story. I should also say in my professional alter ego life, just a couple days ago, I'm a biostatistician, and I was part of a big paper that was published in a prestigious journal. I won't say which one because I keep my identity at least slightly hard to discover, not perfectly hard to discover, but slightly. And it was about the effectiveness of the vaccines. So I've been spending a large part of the last year researching the vaccines, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm like I don't know. It's complicated because as a researcher, it's been frustrating watching the public discourse on the vaccine topic in a way that gets highly polarized. And I think that it discourages people from telling their stories, especially if they're bad stories or negative reactions to the vaccine like you had, because either people don't want those stories out because they think it'll create unnecessary fear and stuff like that, or whatever motivations they might have. And I admire your courage in fighting against that and speaking about what happened to you, even though I'm sure that it was not easy or popular to do so.
Well, I'm lucky, I don't have lucky for many reasons that I don't have a job, outside the home here. And so there's not a whole lot that someone could do to me personally. I think the thing that has been hardest for me is the loss of privacy. And, particularly since the worst of my pain is in my tailbone. How many people really want to go out there in public and go, hey, my tailbone hurts really horribly, right, so I have to lie down most of the time. I've always been more of a private person about medical things. So I think that's where it's been, harder to admit that kind of somewhat embarrassing personal problem. But I've kind of had to, because it's just changed my whole life. But also, yeah, I do want people to know that this could potentially cause some pretty major problems, so that they can take that into account in their informed consent. I've also got a video where I don't even mention the word vaccine, but just an abrupt change on my YouTube called Pain in the Silence of God. And that's gotten a lot of views because it's sort of more generally about suffering and Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, anyone that's more curious about that subject, I'll leave a link to Lydia's appearance on the Dark Horse podcast for anyone who might be curious about that. But like I said, thank you for sharing that, and I'm happy to accommodate whatever you need regarding that for this conversation. So I guess without any further ado, let's get into the eye of the beholder. So why did you write The Eye of the Beholder, and how does it relate to your previous book, The Mirror and the Mask, which we talked about last time?
If you'd asked me 10 years ago, are you ever going to write a book on the Gospel of John? I would have said, well, no, I don't think so. I definitely didn't foresee myself getting as deeply into New Testament scholarship as I have. I realized, I started to realize it in really 2015, but even more strongly in 2017, that doubts about the robust historicity of the Gospels and special doubts about the robust historicity of the Gospel of John were coming into the evangelical world as well as the liberal world. Before I believed in a kind of narrative that I think gets promoted even by some people who know better, of sort of liberals versus conservatives as far as historicity of the Gospels. And at that point, I began to realize that it was a lot more complicated than that. So, and what had happened, especially with the Gospel of John, is that for quite a number of years, we more conservative Christians were told, you know what, let's not really lean too much on the Gospel of John. It's better to meet people where they are, and let's use what larger numbers of scholars acknowledge, which is the historical parts of the synoptics, and we'll just use that. And so the narrative was that, we're not really doubting the historicity of the Gospel of John, but let's just not use it. And people had acquiesced in that. And then suddenly it started to become obvious, and it started to come to light that with some remarks of Craig Evans's that he had made as long ago as 2012, that were then brought to light in 2017, that actually some of these same scholars really were questioning the historicity of the Gospel, or the robust historicity of the Gospel of John. And then I was astonished to find that people were more ready to accept that, or to paper it over, to say, no, that's not really what he said, even though it was really what he had said. It was right out there on video. And so I became concerned about this, and I realized, okay, I may be the only one who has both the time and the inclination and, the perseverance and the chops intellectually to really delve into this and expose this, say it out in plain language, what these scholars are saying, and delve into their supposed reasons for it. So I conceived of a 2-book series, The Mirror or the Mask, which deals with sort of the background and all of these really more obscure reasons that are given in like Greco-Roman biographies and history and exercise books and whatnot, for taking the Gospels to be in a partially non-historical genre, and deals with that somewhat for all 4 of the Gospels. But then the eye of the beholder, which deals with some of the extra questions that have been raised about John, because for many reasons, because John looks different than the synoptics, he comes in for an extra share of skepticism concerning his robust historicity. But you can read them separately, so I don't want anybody to think they have to read both. The people I would most encourage to read both would be people who've heard, rumors and inklings, or maybe more than that, of this claim that, the ancient people had a different view of truth, and the Gospels are in a genre where they're using literary devices that are partially non-historical, and you've thought, well, I guess maybe there's something to that. Then you probably want to read the Mirror or the Mask first. But if you just want to read a book about John, The Eye of the Beholder can stand on its own.
Mm-hmm. So The Mirror and the Mask kind of deals with the larger questions of genre and literary devices and those sorts of things. And you spent a lot of time in all 4 of the Gospels. But the Eye of the Beholder is even more specifically focused on those questions as applied to the Gospel of John. So let's see here. Do you want to talk about, so why of all of the 4 Gospels do we need to have one of your books focus on the Gospel of John? Why isn't, what's unique about John, and why are these questions sort of even more focused on the Gospel of John compared to the Synoptic Gospels?
Right. Well, for one thing, because it's the last gospel. I think everyone has agreed on that. I agree with that. That it
You
was
mean in terms of date of composition,
correct.
not
Yes.
just the order in your New Testament.
Right. That it was written last.
Mm-hmm.
And it is different in the sense that it contains a bunch of stories that aren't in the synoptic gospels, and that's why they're called the synoptic gospels, that sameness of vision, that they tend to cover the same material. And John, he probably thought they had covered that material, so he did something additional. And so it I call it the redheaded stepchild, because it looks different. It comes in for extra question. I think it also comes in for extra question because of its preface, its prelude. In the beginning was the word. And so for a long time, we humans, scholars, whatever, Western man, have had this sort of dichotomy between being heavily theological and strongly historical. And I really think that this even got started in 19th century scholarship, this idea that if an author is heavily theological, then he probably feels free to bend the historical truth for his theological agenda. And that, I think, lies that feeling, well, John is theological, therefore not as strongly historical, lies spoken or unspoken at the back of a lot of question about the Gospel of John. There's also been a huge amount of ink spilled, even more than on the other three, about authorship. And so I knew I was going to have to delve into that literature and address that, and couldn't possibly do that in the same book where I'm doing all this stuff on genre. So, they're both pretty hefty books. So you can see there was plenty of material to cover in both of them.
Sure. Yeah, I think that what you said there about the distinction between a theological focus and a historical focus, while in general, I think that you and I are both in agreement that general standards of truthfulness in explaining events wasn't really that different then than it is now. I think one thing that we have a hard time understanding about, perhaps, if there is a difference in the ancient perspective, or what I mean by ancient, the perspective around the time of the composition of the Gospel of John and our time, is that I think that they didn't view theological truth and historical truth as separate. I would say, if anything, part of the whole point of the Gospel of John is this is theologically important and profound, and it really happened, right?
I strongly agree. I couldn't agree more with what you just said there. Absolutely. Somebody said to me in a session at a conference, well, how do you think the ancient view of truth might be different from ours? And I said, if anything, they were even more literal minded than we are, and didn't view those as at odds at all. So in other words, I'm going like in exactly the opposite direction from a lot of scholarship on the relationship of history to theology.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also this sort of general modern bias, I guess, maybe that, could a guy ever go around like Jesus does in the Gospel of John, proclaiming his extreme exalted theological and cosmological importance, however we exactly want to define that? And we sort of like, well, no one would ever actually talk that way. No one would ever understand themselves that way and communicate that to other people, and other people would believe it. And I think that that's a prejudice that just actually isn't as true as we think, that it actually wasn't as, it was more possible that someone would walk around and say those things about themselves, I am the way, the truth, and the life, etc. That right. Those sorts of exalted claims about oneself, and an audience kind of, well, obviously in the Gospel of John, some people believe it and some people don't. That's another very important theme in the Gospel of John. But
right, they're horribly offended. I mean, they're angry.
Mm-hmm.
So the if somebody did that nowadays, we just think he was a kook. We wouldn't throw stones at him.
Right. And I think that, I don't know, honestly, one of the ways in which I feel like that helps me understand the Gospel of John and why someone could go around and talk like that, and why what I'm about to say will be misunderstood at first, but I'll circle back around and correct it, is like if you watch documentaries about cults or something like that, that cults will often have someone in them who has an extremely exalted view of themselves and people who believe it, right? And I think modern Western people in our normal lives just don't encounter people like that very much, or don't live in an environment where that was somewhat common. And I'm not at all saying that Jesus was a cult founder, but I'm saying something of that view that someone could be a living, breathing, acting out, theologically important figure is just not something that we encounter. So we just assume that it couldn't have been historical if someone is documenting that about someone else in the past. We just have to assume, well, layers and legends and mythologizing happened over the ensuing decades that obscured the historical figure. But if a historical figure actually does run around saying things like, I am the true vine and I am the bread of life that comes down from heaven and stuff like that, there's just this sort of a priori assumption that no one would ever say that. So therefore, anyone who tries to record those sorts of sayings as being historical must not be historical. And I think that bias, which sure, we could blame it on some 19th century Germans. I like blaming lots of problems on 19th century Germans, but so I think that's another piece of this puzzle. I don't know. I was speaking for myself
I often have to point out that it's not a miracle for Jesus to say those things. I mean, like, I'm willing to acknowledge a somewhat higher standard of burden of proof for a miraculous claim. But then I'll point out, for Jesus to just stand there and say this is not in itself a miracle, right? I mean, it's a man standing there saying it. And I find that that's kind of a salutary jolt to people to point that out, because you find that the scholarly skepticism about it almost puts it on a level with his turning water into wine. Like, they make it almost as hard to believe that he made these claims. Now, mind you, as far as commonness and rareness are concerned, if anything, he was taking his life in his hands to say it. But that's because of the very theologically and politically charged environment. I think maybe some of the skepticism that you're referring to also comes in for the fact that Jesus is the founder of a religion that has millions and millions of members throughout the world and throughout history. So he doesn't look like a cult leader. I mean, cults are usually smaller. And so I think people feel a little bit like it's almost disrespectful to him to say that he really made these strong statements about himself, because then, how come he wasn't just dismissed as a kook or only had a small following or something like that? And so then it gets, as you say, assumed that it's a matter of reactional layers.
Yeah. So I guess let's kind of move on a little bit into some of the specific topics that you cover in your book. You talked a little bit about authorship. Could you explain what your views are on the authorship of the Gospel of John?
I take it to have been written by John, the son of Zebedee, a member of the 12. So this very, very, what I call traditional view of the authorship of the Gospel of John. In the book, I do deal in an appendix with the view of Richard Balcom, that it was written by a different person who was a disciple of Jesus, whose name was also John, but who supposedly was not a member of the 12. In other words, there were two close disciples of Jesus named John. It was a relatively common name, but he holds this view, and there are a lot of people who would agree with me on historicity matters who have come to adopt Balcom's view. So that's why I separated it into an appendix, because I didn't want it to seem that you could not agree with me on its robust historicity while holding Balcom's view. And yet at the same time, I thought that it needed to be addressed, because I thought that it was incorrect. And to some extent, it makes it a little harder for the author to travel with Jesus, for example, in Galilee. Balcom thinks that the author got his stories about Galilee at secondhand, and that doesn't mean that they're not, true. But I think he was traveling with Jesus the whole time as a member of the 12. So I thought it was worth addressing, and so I went ahead and put that in an appendix. But I think the evidence for authorship by John, the son of Zebedee, is just overwhelming, actually.
Yeah, I've heard that Bauchamite view of one of the scholars that I'm hoping to talk to is Father John Baer. He's an Eastern Orthodox scholar, and he's written a book on the Gospel of John, and he takes the Baucham view that it's a John that's a disciple, but not the son of Zebedee. So you know, a non-apostolic but still disciple level follower of Jesus, I guess, is sort of the way to put it. So what are some of the reasons why you think that this John the son of Zebedee is more likely than just John a disciple?
Well, one of the things that I say in the book that I don't think I've seen anybody else say, you know, maybe someone has, but is that I see the book as having this traveling perspective. And so, for example, when Jesus is down in the Judea area and he's planning to go to Galilee, the narrative perspective is looking with Jesus toward Galilee. And when Jesus is in Galilee and he's planning to go to Judea, the narrative perspective is with Jesus in Galilee, planning to go to Judea. It's very remarkable. And there are also marks of eyewitness testimony in the Galilee stories, like the feeding of the 5,000. It's actually a unique version of the feeding of the 5,000, not the same as the synoptic versions. I think the author was clearly there. So for that reason, once you have someone traveling with Jesus, a lot of, and you reject what I consider to be just a completely wrong argument that he was a sort of Judea bound, like he was a stay-at-home, high-born Judea guy who just hung out in Jerusalem. Once you reject that, then it becomes harder and harder to distinguish this from the son of Zebedee, and a lot of the evidential motivation goes away. I also think there's evidence of his having been, and so this, I'm giving you the internal evidence. The external evidence is absolutely overwhelming. I mean, I go into that in detail. I just don't think any church father ever thought that it was written by a different John. I think you just have to strain that external evidence like crazy. But I'm giving you right now some stuff that I think is more unique in my book, or more unusual, that you won't find elsewhere. I think there's evidence internally of it's being written by a fisherman, which again does not fit with the picture that they give of this other John. So, for example, he's out in the boat and they're rowing and there's this terrible storm and they see Jesus coming toward them and he estimates how far they've rowed before they see Jesus. Like that's not a landlubber, you know, that's a guy who can estimate about how far they've rowed even in the middle of a howling storm, and then they see somebody walking in the water. Or in John 21, he's clearly with Peter when they go out to go fishing, and Peter just says, "Hey, I'm going fishing all night." You know, and if this author just traveled with them to Galilee because Jesus said he would meet them after his resurrection, that doesn't mean he has to go out fishing all night with Peter. But apparently, you know, they say, "We're going with you," and the beloved disciple is one of them. So, you know, why did he do that? You know, sightseeing tour or what? So he's someone who is comfortable with boats and the world of fishing. And then, as I say, I just think the external evidence is overwhelming. More important, of course, to me is that it was written by an eyewitness, which could be either of those two people, because that's what's, you know, really crucial to historicity.
Mm-hmm. So beyond just whether it was John the Apostle or John, a non-apostolic disciple, what are some of the evidence for it being an eyewitness?
Right. So there's both external and internal. And so notice too that these arguments fulfill multiple roles. There are arguments for its being written by an eyewitness. There are arguments for its being strongly historical, for its having a strongly historical intention. There are arguments against this kind of weird mixed genre thesis where just all of a sudden, without warning, he's narrating things that didn't really happen that way, but he's seamlessly melding them in. So all of this just kind of goes in there. And I think one thing I strongly wanted to do in this book was to break down a wall that has been put up where you have certain things that scholars will go, okay, that bit is historical. Yeah, okay, that's evidence that there's history in John, etc. And then they kind of quarantine those. They kind of put this invisible force field or something above them so that they can't have any wider ramifications that, the whole book is intended to be historical. And I'm trying to break that down. I'm trying to say, no, this illustrates that. So, well, we've got both external and internal evidence. We have this huge embarrassment of riches, really. So external evidence are things like he mentions Bethany was 15 furlongs from Jerusalem. And he does this just in passing, apropos of the many mourners who came to mourn with Mary and Martha over their brother's death. In John 11, it was near to Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs. And sure enough, we've got this town. It's actually a modern town, which is like the place of Lazarus. And it's considered to, be the, by long tradition, the place of Lazarus' grave. And it's about 15 furlongs, when you translate that from Jerusalem. Or his mention of Cana, like nobody even would have cared about Cana. Cana was this obscure little town. So even his mention of it, its existence, is evidence of his having actually been there. And then he also uses this term going down from Cana to Capernaum. He mentions that a couple times. Just casually, when people are traveling, they went down. And all of our sort of candidate locations for Cana are in the hills of Galilee. And so you would go down because Capernaum is even below sea level. Mm-hmm. So all those there's a ton of them, these external things, and they're wonderfully subtle. He does it in passing. He's not parading his knowledge.
Right. So there's this texture of geographic detail in the Gospel of John that the way that it's mentioned almost as an aside, or not like the real focus of the sentence that it's in or any of those things, that it just seems to kind of flow from the author as he's recounting the story, gives a testament of historicity and eyewitnessness to the physical geography of the events.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be like, if I referred to the Shell station on Cork Street here in my town, and people who are from the town, they know there is a Shell station down at the bottom of the hill on Cork Street. It's just like that because I live here. So that's what it's like. And then there's all this internal stuff, and I try to bring out some categories that are not extremely common, but need to be brought back. So I got a number of things from Leon Morris, who's a scholar. I believe he died in the 80s, but he wrote in the 60s, and I'm trying to bring those more to knowledge. So things like actual asides, where the author pauses and he says, this is what Jesus meant by this. Well, that's evidence that he's making a distinction between what he is thinking Jesus meant and what he's trying to tell you Jesus really said. He's not just putting his own interpretations into Jesus' mouth. D.A. Carson emphasizes that as well as evidence of historicity and evidence of scrupulousness, I would say, in historicity. Mm-hmm. Another thing.
What's an example of that?
Yeah, so at the temple cleansing in John 2, Jesus says, destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the author pauses and says, he said this concerning his body. Mm-hmm. And it's obvious that the immediate audience doesn't understand. And the author emphasizes that the disciples understood this after Jesus rose from the dead. So if he thought it was okay to just put his own words into Jesus' mouth, he would have had Jesus, later, maybe the disciples ask him, which sometimes happens in the synoptics,
Mm-hmm.
what did you mean by that? And Jesus says, do you not understand? I am speaking of my body, or something. He could have like created a dialogue like that, but he doesn't. He just, because it apparently didn't happen that way. So he just pauses and tells you what it is. Or John 7, when Jesus says, if any man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. As the Spirit says, if anyone believes on me, out of his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. And then it pauses, and the narrator says, this he said concerning the Spirit who was not yet given. So he's distinguishing his own interpretation from what Jesus, the historical Jesus, actually said. I think that's a really important evidence of internal evidence of historicity. Another one is
the sort of exegetical layer on top of Jesus's sayings, where one of the common accusations against John is that he's putting his theology and his later interpretation or Christianization or whatever of Jesus's historical sayings into Jesus's lips in a way that Jesus didn't actually say. But that doesn't really fit with the fact that John often, in many places, has Jesus speak and then gives his own theological explanation or exegesis of what Jesus meant.
Exactly. Another kind of evidence is vividness, and it's so important to realize that they didn't have highly realistic fiction at the time. They had fiction, so you'll get your skeptics, hasn't she ever heard of this ancient novel? Yes, I've heard of that ancient novel. I've read parts of it. And by the way, I also have a PhD in literature, in English literature. And that stuff is so unrealistic. It's fun. It's super over the top and everything. But the Gospels aren't like this at all. They have this soberness to them. And yet they have vividness. So when John describes, for example, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, there's this sense of like his eyes actually, all of a sudden, it's like he took off his outer garment, he put on his, he girded himself with a towel, and he washed their feet. So it's like you can actually see Jesus doing it. I often say John is the author of physical motion. He likes physical motion. So even in the story of Mary Magdalene, now he would not have been there, but I think she told it to him, and she might have even used gestures or whatever. So he's describing literally how many times she's turning back to look into the tomb. She looks into the tomb. She's just been speaking to the angels. She doesn't realize they're angels. And then she turns around and sees Jesus, doesn't recognize him. And it looks like she actually answers him sort of abstractedly. And while she's answering him, she must be turning around and looking back into the tomb once more. Like, he should be there. Where is he? Why isn't the body there? And then Jesus says her name, Mary. And she turns again and says to him, Rabbi. And then she flings herself at his feet, clinging to him and so forth. And that's just remarkable in an ancient author, that degree of vividness, but without rhetorical, over the top. I mean, Quintilian, the ancient oratory teacher, he's like, hey, you're a lawyer. He's teaching lawyers, try to make your audience cry, try to make your audience be on your side, try to, blah, blah, blah. But it's completely different when he gives an example of describing a murder. There's this, it's subtle, but it's so real, this difference between what Quintilian tells them to do, which is like, imagine, if you will, friends, the cry of anguish and the victim pleading for his life. And it's like, gross, it's like too much. And what John does, which will move you, but it moves you in a different way. It moves you in this way of, he's describing it in a sense, very matter of factly. And it's just what happens that is so vivid and so moving. And I'm trying to give the reader a sense of that unique vividness that John has that's all his own. It is so unusual in an ancient document. So those are some of the internal reasons, and there are more for thinking of this as witness testimony or coming at, at most sometimes at one remove.
Yeah. So you mentioned cleansing of temples. I think that maybe we should spend a little bit of time on who and how and when temples get cleansed. So one of the accusations against John is that the Synoptic Gospels have a temple cleansing that's seemingly during Passion Week, after Jesus has entered on Palm Sunday. And whereas in the Gospel of John, there is a temple cleansing, or at least something that seems similar, that happens not on the visit to Jerusalem where Jesus gets crucified, but a much earlier visit, seemingly towards the beginning of Jesus's ministry. So how do you understand that detail in the Gospel of John, and how does that relate to its historicity?
Excellent question about the temple cleansing. That does get brought up a lot. I did a series on the temple cleansing on my YouTube channel, so I can send you the link to the playlist for that, where I go into that in a lot of detail if people are interested, because I did a whole series of several videos on that. The temple cleansing does get used against John's robust historicity, and it's impressive, in not necessarily a good sense, how many evangelical scholars have just accepted that John moved the temple cleansing and moved it in what I call a dischronological sense. And it's really important to be clear about this, because sometimes people who hear John moved the temple cleansing, they think, oh, that's not any big deal. That just means he narrated it earlier. Like we might jump around in time somewhat in our narration because we happen to think of something. But no, what's meant by the statement that John moved the temple cleansing is that he tried to make it look like it happened earlier when he knew it really happened later. And that's what I call dischronology, where you're actually changing the time in your story when something happened from when it really happened. So I think there were two temple cleansings. I don't think that's a big deal at all. They're not uncannily similar. They're generically similar, generally similar in the sense that two different events of the same kind easily could be similar. I like to use the analogy of a political protest or an ideological protest of some kind. So, for example, maybe people standing with signs outside of the Supreme Court about some issue, or outside of an abortion clinic or something. It might be the same clinic, it might be similar signs, but it's happening, there are different times because people, the issue, whatever the issue was that was concerning them, is still there. And so they come back and they do something similar on a different occasion. But there's no uncanny similarity. Yes, he drives out the animals because that's what he was upset about, on both occasions. But it's not like the exact same dialogue takes place or something like that makes it so strained. And yet, even so famous and staunch a Christian as William Lane Craig will almost laugh at the idea of two temple cleansings. He says, oh, these are just too similar. It's such a strained harmonization to say that it happened twice. And I'm sorry, that's just not true. When you read them with a more open mind, you see that they could easily be two different occasions, just as they appear to be when you read the four Gospels at face value. The other argument that is made is that the religious leaders, quote unquote, would not have let Jesus continue in ministry for several years if he had cleansed the temple early. Now, this is, I think, it's a very bogus objection, to be very blunt about it, because what do we know about what they would not have done? Is there some kind of historical law that says, hey, if somebody goes in there and turns over a table and drives out the money changers and the animals, commencing destruction in 20 seconds, 19, 18, 17, you got to die within a week. Mm-hmm. There's no such historical law at all. And indeed, even in the Synoptics, the cleansing of the temple is not like the one and only and inevitable cause of their seeking to kill him. The Synoptics draw attention to the parable of the vineyard. and like explicitly say, and then he, they sought to kill him. Of course, they were seeking to kill him for a lot of reasons, the religious leaders. So it's just this very wooden idea. And quite frankly, if all we had was the Gospel of John, I believe that the scholars would not be out there saying, oh, they wouldn't have let him live so long, this must have been moved. The only reason that they're bringing that up in a kind of an ad hoc manner is because they are uncomfortable with two temple cleansings, and because they prefer the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke as being somewhat more historical than the Gospel of John. And so then you get this kind of bogus, oh, they never would have let him live after doing that for all those years. Why not? It's the beginning of his ministry. Even murderous religious leaders take a while to decide to try to get a guy crucified. It's not like necessarily the first thought that occurs to them when he offends them.
And there's also this seeming difficulty for the religious leaders that Jesus's popularity makes it hard, and
that comes up a lot.
That they need to have the right time in order to be able to pull it off. That it's not just like the religious leaders in Jerusalem are omnipotent, and that Jesus is completely vulnerable either. There's a little bit of
all the Gospels
that there's this sort of popular level tussle, right, that sometimes protects Jesus, sometimes doesn't, and that sort of thing. So yeah,
right. History's complicated, right? Mm-hmm. All sorts of different factors go into it, including, as you're alluding to here, the willingness of Judas to betray Jesus to them when there's not a big crowd around.
Right. And that was seemingly part of the whole point of why they needed someone to portray him, is so that they could catch him at a vulnerable time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So a lot of factors go into his having been crucified when he was crucified, not simply his cleansing the temple.
Right. And I think we also forget that, back then, the Roman guards had maybe better swords and spears and stuff like that, but the religious Jewish leadership might not have had. And, the same weapons that the leaders have kind of are out there among the people, and it's still mostly muscle and brute force anyway. And so a large crowd can actually prevent a organized leadership from accomplishing what they want to accomplish. It's
right.
Not
and
like
in John, they try. They send them to arrest him, and they don't arrest him.
Right. It's not like our modern world where there's cop cars and guns and stuff like that, and it's relatively easy to arrest people that you want to arrest if you know where they are. Yeah.
Right. And they also allegedly were not allowed to kill anybody. Mm-hmm. They could beat them, but they weren't supposed to kill them. And Stephen gets lynched in Acts. I mean, this kind of spontaneous thing that they get away with, but legally they weren't supposed to. And that's why then they also want him crucified, terribly bloodthirsty and vindictive. So that's why they have to go through this elaborate thing of dragging him off to Pilate and stuff, so they have to come up with a plan, and it takes them a while first to decide that he's really a threat and that they really want to kill him, and then to decide how they want to kill him, and then to get somebody to betray him and so forth, and getting madder and madder as he's making all of these high exalted claims for himself and so forth. A very believable picture. It's a very credible picture where an early temple cleansing can fit into that just fine.
Yeah. And so even beyond just the temple cleansing question, that sort of tussle between Jesus's popularity and the wanting to have him killed for multiple reasons on multiple instances is something that is true in and portrayed in all four of the Gospels. That is another thing that seems to confirm their historical agreement with each other.
That's right. That picture is very clear. And then in the sense that there were also crowd levels where some of those crowds tried to kill him. So again, that complexity of history. Sometimes they think of the crowd as defending him, but other times the crowd attempts to stone him.
Right. And so there might have been different factions of crowds also. And yeah, yep. So those are all interesting questions. So One thing I want to ask about is we've talked a little bit about geography and the physical events, but let's also talk about Jesus's words and how Jesus speaks and how Jesus sounds in the Gospel of John, and comparing that with the synoptics. Another point that's often made is that Jesus just sounds totally different in the Gospel of John than the synoptic Gospels. In the synoptics, there's a lot more emphasis on parables and healings and exorcisms and that sort of thing. And in John, there's seemingly lots of disputes with the Jews, and then these sort of monologues where he's either, talking about the I am something or I am a different thing, and these sort of long prayers like the high priestly prayer in John 17. So how do you understand the differences or the lack of differences between the way Jesus just kind of talks and sounds in the Gospel of John compared to the synoptics?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I would actually say that may be one of the number one, that may be the number one reason or argument that's given against the robust historicity of John. And it'll be put in there sort of like a chisel in a chink to kind of pry apart the stones of a person's confidence in the robust historicity of John. Is like, well, scholars think he sounds really different. That's a way in which my book is unusual. I don't know of any other book out there, and there may be one, but I don't know of one that spends as much time on that question. 3 chapters at least of The Eye of the Beholder are focused on that question, and I think you could fold in portions of other chapters as well that address it, because I realized how important it was. And so, like, I'm very consciously trying to deal with that from a very very admittedly conservative perspective, in order to kind of just remove once and for all that as an argument that John changed history, or that he embellished or elaborated or composed Jesus' words. Notice that in the way that you were portraying it there, and that's very accurate to the way that it is made, the absence of parables in John is folded into the Jesus sounds so different. Now, I would separate that out as a completely different issue from the phrase that's often used, which is Johannine idiom, because Johannine idiom should be about the actual words of Jesus, maybe what you might refer to as his accent, his his use of
his personal style.
Exactly, and which words he tends to use more than other words, and that kind of thing. Whereas the parable question is so easily dealt with as just, there's 3 gospels that have lots of parables. And so I think John is very aware of the synoptics. I think he had heard them read or read them himself. And I think he's like, we've covered that, boys. And so then he's trying to do things that that haven't already been, done to death, in a sense. So that's not an issue. And also, I think John loves to just take more time. I mean, even when he's telling about a miracle, like the miracle of the man born blind, he takes a whole chapter for it. Whereas the synoptics are more trying to cram in as many miracles or discourses or whatever, as many events as they can, and so they tell them shorter. So if John's going to tell about what Jesus said on an occasion, he's going to tell about it at more length. It's just his interest in what he's doing. So that's part of it. I also subscribe to the view that probably John sounds like Jesus more than Jesus being made to sound like John. Now, Jesus and John, if John is indeed the son of Zebedee, came from the same region, even within Palestine, the same sub-region, which would be Galilee, John being a fisherman there on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus being raised in Nazareth, so that their style of speech should be similar is not improbable at all. So, for example, if Jesus was speaking Aramaic in some of these, and that's a whole fascinating question in itself. I think Jesus did speak Greek, and I think we don't always know whether originally he was speaking Aramaic. And John's translation.
Can we talk about that a little bit more, the language question? So one of the particular details is there are things where, like the most poignant example is when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and where he says, "Behold, you must be born again." The Greek word "again" can also mean above, or from above, excuse me. And so it's sort of often interpreted that Jesus is sort of making, there's a confusion where Nicodemus hears "again," whereas Jesus meant "from above," and that either this intentional confusion or wordplay or double entendre or something is at work in that story, and it only works in Greek. So what are your views about A, that particular story, and B, what languages Jesus could have spoken, and what was his Greek, the possibility for his Greek competence like?
Right. Well, Stanley Porter is the man to read on this. I mean, he's, really done the research. And also Peter J. Williams has some lectures out about this. I think it's undeniable that Jesus and his disciples spoke Greek. But that doesn't mean he was always speaking Greek. He could have, some of these things could have been originally in Aramaic, some originally in Greek. And I think we don't know. I would not. Now, Peter Williams has done some work arguing that the Sermon on the Mount was originally delivered in Greek. I'm not going to go out on a limb that far, but I do think it's possible. So there's no problem with Jesus speaking Greek. If he did, though, I think it may have been an Aramaic style Greek, because I think Aramaic would have been his first language, what you might call his mother tongue. And that would have been true for John, the son of Zebedee, as well. So for both of them to be speaking a somewhat Aramaic styled Greek is highly probable. And
right, like it's sort of similar to, for recent historical events, I've heard a lot of Russian and Ukrainian people speaking English recently, and you can kind of tell beyond just their accent, also their locution and their word order and their word choice. You can recognize that is a Russian mind speaking English because of
German too. You can see if a native German speaker speaks English, you can sometimes catch that too. Exactly. And so, for example, the use of the connective kai. Kai is Greek connective. It's John's favorite word, and it's like his favorite connective. And. So whereas Luke will use these more, a wider variety of connectives, John will just use kai for most of his connecting needs, as it were. And this is true in Jesus' language as well. But we don't actually know that Jesus, didn't use kai that much. Not that it matters. It doesn't have to be absolutely verbatim. So if Luke is sometimes giving Jesus a wider variety of connectives, so what? I mean, that's paraphrasing the most trivial of senses, that it would still be recognizable if you were there and you understood the language. But as a matter of fact, I think John may be recording something that's closer to the way that Jesus actually talked. And the other thing is that I think he was very young at the time. And I think, to use a jargon term, he imprinted on Jesus very strongly. And Jesus just was the biggest influence of his life, as was true of all of the disciples. Mm-hmm. And so we might even get in the Johannine epistles, almost an exaggerated version of it. And you know how sometimes a student will learn to talk like his teacher, and he'll almost do it more than the teacher does it, his style or whatever. But that circling around style that Jesus does in his longer discourses that people call Johannine idiom, I think Jesus may have really used that. It actually is more of a real speaker style than the chappiness you find in the synoptics. I think they're cutting out some of the repetition, where John is giving us more of the repetitiousness of a real speaker. Jesus likes to loop back to the same topic. And I think he did have a remarkable memory. But again, that doesn't mean it has to be absolutely verbatim. So I think all of these things are coming into play, a lot of these different things. Also themes. The other thing is, people use the word Johannine idiom just to refer to themes. Well, that can just be selection. John's interested in the topic of the truth or testimony to the truth. So he remembers more of the things that Jesus said on those topics.
Yeah, so I think that another interesting also explanation is that John might be doing, capturing more of how Jesus sounded to his own disciples. And I don't mean to try and introduce some sort of strong esoteric, exoteric, esoteric distinction, like say some of the Gnostic Gospels were, where Jesus had an entirely different teaching to his own disciples. But you can see this in the gospel, all the synoptic gospels too, where he'll give a parable to the crowd and then he'll explain it to his disciples in a way that he didn't do to the crowd. So it's not like esoteric, exoteric. It's just natural to have a slightly more intimate way of talking about things with the people you know better than the people that you don't know as well. And
right.
that John is capturing some of the more intimate sorts of ways that Jesus would talk with and teach to his own disciples.
I think there's truth in that, especially with respect to a phrase like little children, or, you are my friends. So he's, I do not call you servants, but friends, and that kind of thing. Jesus is pretty explicit. I'm giving you a new commandment, and that new commandment is being given specifically to his disciples. So in terms of content, I think there's truth to that. In terms of style, though, I emphasize that less than some other, even really, conservative scholars will emphasize that the style is different when he's talking to his disciples. I think the style may be similar. And one argument I would make for that is John 6, because John 6, the bread of life discourse, is given to a larger group in the synagogue in Capernaum. And it's got that same, he repeats himself. He
says an I
am the bread of life. Exactly. In fact, in a sense, John 6 is the paradigmatic I am discourse. There's an exaggeration. There are not 7 I am discourses. That was something I really caught Craig Evans on in a debate that we did several years ago. He said there are 7 discourses where Jesus says, I am something. And then he goes on to explain this over the rest of the discourse. That's not true. There are, maybe 2. And but the bread of life does fit that description, and that is to a wider crowd. So, Richard Bauckham has a real interesting article. I can't remember the name of it right now, but where he says, Jesus could not have, or very likely did not, speak in the choppy way that's recorded in the synoptics, because that's not how real speakers talk, where you're just like boom, 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 like everything is a string of little aphorisms or whatever. Maybe the Beatitudes, because that's got this flow, internal flow to it. But a lot of times it's just one thing jumping from one topic to another. And so he says, in a sense, the style in the Gospel of John is more like the style of a real speaker. Now, Bauckham himself doesn't take that in as conservative direction as he could. He kind of turns around and says, and this needed to involve putting more words in Jesus' mouth. And I'm like, wait, why? And I think there's this unspoken idea that John could not have remembered even approximately how a connected discourse of this kind went. That I think is false. I think, it could take a good memory. It doesn't have to be a tape recorder memory, but a really good memory, you could remember approximately how it went, even with those repetitions.
It's not like John would have heard it in 30 AD, never thought about it, and then writes it or transcribes it in 80 AD. He had been a Christian teacher and gospel preacher and church organizer for that whole intervening period. And seemingly it would be entirely plausible that he talked about this so regularly that it was routinized in his own mind. And so,
exactly. That's so important. I emphasize that in the book. And, people talk about oral tradition as, rooting it in other people's minds, but giving the story roots it in the mind of the speaker as well. It's like such an important point. And I think it tends to counter these a priori ideas about what John couldn't remember.
Right. So I think that is also an important idea, that the words there could be a long gap between, like a 40-50 year gap between composition and the event, but there could be a very strong oral repetition in between that could cement it in his own mind in a way that makes it more reliable than talking to your grandpa and asking him to remember a conversation he had in high school or something like that.
Although you might be surprised at how well your grandpa can do about that if it was an important conversation. But I agree. I think you're right. And your grandpa may have thought of that conversation in the privacy of his own mind too. There's that as well. I myself go over conversations and things I've heard a lot, in my mind, even when I'm not, saying them to other people. I don't want to lean too heavily on it, but some evidence for what we're saying here comes in the fact that you do get phrases like eternal life and references to that in the Pauline epistles. And I'm not saying there's any exact quotation of John in the Pauline epistles, that I'm not saying, but certain conceptual ideas that some have thought of as Johannine are at least equally Pauline.
Yeah. I find that true, that there are so many of the powerful and important verses in the Gospel of John. You can find a shockingly good cross-reference in a Pauline epistle. And especially like glory, like if you just do a word search on glory, the Gospel of John talks a lot about glory, and so does the Pauline epistle. So where's all this glory talk coming from? Or just Paul and John independently deciding to focus on glory, or does that have a common source? All of those sorts of questions.
Right, exactly. And that, let's consider the shocking idea that that's really what Jesus talked about, and that Paul heard about that from Jesus' apostles, maybe John, maybe somebody else, and that gets rooted in Paul's mind.
Right. So I guess we should maybe be kind of coming to a close somewhat soon. I guess I wanted to ask you sort of say that you've been focusing on John so much that his own character is getting in your mind a little bit, and that he's rubbing off on you. What do you feel like you've learned about John himself and his own style by focusing on this topic for so long?
I think it's that melding we were talking about at the beginning of theology and history. I think John may have been something of a mystic. I certainly am not. I am far. I never have any mystical experiences whatsoever. But what I think we have to realize is that John's kind of quote unquote theological mystic is intensely empirical. And it's almost shocking that it's a person who remembers real historical details in this way, that they're just burned on his mind. So when, Judas goes out, Jesus says, what you do quickly. And he goes out, and it says, and it was night, that he could see. Ian Blakelock, who is he's a classicist, talks about this, that one oblong of darkness stamped itself forever on John's mind. Probably there were no windows, and they opened the door, and the sun is set, it's dark. So that's what John is like. He who saw it bear record, and his record is true, and he knows that what he is saying is true. John 19:35, he's standing there by the foot of the cross, and they come and they put the spear in Jesus' side just to make sure that he's dead. They don't break his legs, and he's watching all of this, and the blood and the water come pouring out like right next to him. He's standing right there. It's so graphic, and it's so gruesome, and it's so vivid, and it stamps itself on his mind. And then he sees theological meanings in all of this. Not a bone of him shall be broken, but it's founded, passionately in this empirical set of events. That's what I've strongly realized about John, and I think that's embodied in my cover picture for the book, which I commissioned. My cover art, and that was done by a Catholic artist named Timothy Jones, and then we had a Photoshop done to put the name on it. So it's that eye of the beholder is the eye of John, and then reflected in it are the crosses, the 3 crosses on the hill, because he was actually there. And so all of his profound theological depth springs from these real events that he remembers and knows about and wants to tell you about.
Right, like at the beginning of 1 John, where he's talking about what he has beheld, what he has seen, and what he has touched, right? Doesn't he even use the word touch in sort of
Yes,
the
our hands have
opening.
handled.
Our hands have handled that sense of him, that there is this fusion of, you could say, theological meaning and mystical revelation and importance. Yes, you're not throwing that out, but it's also, this is what happened, right? You know, I saw, like, the real physical events were just saturated with spiritual and theological meaning. They aren't two separate things.
Right, right. And that it wouldn't have a meaning if it didn't happen. You know, I've got this quotation from Leon Morris: what is the theological meaning of an event that never happened? And I think John totally understands that. The phrase I use for that is fake points don't make points. And that's, I think, how John thought.
Right. And he cares so much about imparting the theological significance of Jesus, and he does that by talking about the historical part of Jesus.
Right,
and
including little details that don't have theological meaning in and of themselves. Like, for example, I'm not saying that when John says they caught 153 fish, I'm opposed to the attempt to give symbolic meaning to the 153 fish. I think he just remembers it was 153 fish. But the theological meaning of the event is that Jesus had risen, and then Jesus did this miracle. It was another great catch of fish, similar to the one in Luke. And there's even kind of humor in it because they've fished all night and he says, throw your net on the other side. And they do, and then they catch them. That's the theological meaning. And so then he can, in a sense, he can afford to be throwing in these little details that he just remembers the exact same way that your grandpa would just remember, yeah, and that was a Tuesday, you know, and it's not like he's putting any symbolic meaning on it being a Tuesday, but it's still this incredibly important event that he's remembering.
Yeah, and I think some people could misunderstand what you're trying to say and what you're trying to emphasize to be something like you're trying to strip away the theological meaning of what John is saying and to only sort of turn it into something like a newspaper article or something like that, and that's the wrong genre or something like that. And this talk about genres is a whole nother conversation.
Right, another whole conversation.
But I think that's a misunderstanding of your work and your emphasis. And I think that you are right to care about John's historical, what he views as the importance of the historicity of what he's saying, and that is not in any way at odds or competitive with the theological importance of what he's saying.
Right. The only place that I do see them somewhat in competition is for highly specific details. And I do think that we should steer away from speculative theories about something like, well, now I'm going to go over to Mark, because this is the one that happens to spring to my mind. When Mark says that at the feeding of the 5,000, they sat down on the green grass. You know, I don't think we need to go, oh, you know, what is the green? You know, what's the theological meaning of green, or the green grass there, that kind of thing. I tend to think that a lot of those they're what I call, you know, memoir and reportage, and that John is reminiscing. And so he's just like calling this stuff up out of the depths of his being, but it's been burned onto his mind because of the broader theological importance of things like, you know, Jesus' miracles, Jesus rising from the dead, Jesus' death, Jesus' fulfillment of prophecy, and so forth.
Yeah. Do you have any other closing thoughts or any other things that you want to say before we wrap up?
I just want to encourage people to get a hold of any of my books that they think would be useful. My 3 books are in this topic are Hidden in Plain View, The Mirror or the Mask, and The Eye of the Beholder. Those are my 3 New Testament books. And please consider liking and subscribing to my YouTube channel. I try to put content on there as I'm able every week. And then if you want to follow my work more, consider following my author Facebook page. I have both a Lydia McGrew author Facebook page and a Lydia McGrew Facebook page. You don't have to be my friend, Facebook friend, to follow either of those. And that'll kind of update you about, you know, what I'm doing, and if I have a new article that comes out or something like that, I always going to put that on my author page. And with links, if possible. I've just recently had some articles published on the genre of the Gospels and chronology in the Gospels. I put those links on there. And I always put my YouTube links on there as well. If you want to write to me with a question, my email is lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Please introduce yourself a little bit so I kind of just know who I'm talking to, and try to keep it, if possible, to one specific question that is important to you, rather than like a great big list of, I got all these 500 questions or whatever. But I do want people to be able to write to me, and I do want to, be helpful to the body of Christ as much as I can.
Great. I will put links to all of those things in the description of the YouTube video and on the podcast. So hopefully anyone listening didn't have to jot all that down. And I'll also just say we barely scratched the surface, really, of the content of your books, and that if you find this subject interesting and you want to go deeper than we did in this podcast, there is way, way more material that we didn't cover than that we did cover. And so I would encourage anyone who is still interested to keep going in that direction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And if there's any of those links that you don't have, I will get them to you before you post this. So thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you, Lydia.